The caravan moves before dawn, when the desert is still cold, and the world is quiet enough to hide what is happening. A long line of figures drags across the sand, ankles chained, wrists bound, bodies already thinning from hunger and fear. No banners, no drums, no victory songs, only the soft scrape of iron, the cough of dust in dry throats, and the low moans of those who are learning, too late, that screaming changes nothing. These are not prisoners of war. They are not criminals. They are daughters, wives, girls taken from villages that no longer exist. The Arab slave trade did not begin with markets. It began with disappearance. With doors kicked in before sunrise, with fires rising behind fleeing families, with hands grabbing hair, arms, infants, and pulling them into a future they could not imagine. History often describes this trade in numbers, routes, and dates: Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, as if geography were the story. But the story lives in these bodies, in the way women are forced to walk barefoot over stone until skin splits, in the way some are already bleeding before the journey truly begins, in the way the weakest are quietly unchained and left behind because the caravan cannot afford mercy. For many, death would come. For others, something worse. Because what waited at the end of this road was not simply slavery. It was ownership of the body, of fertility, of silence, of future. This was not labor alone. It was consumption, and the women knew it. Even if they did not yet have the language for it, their fear already understood. The caravan keeps moving. The sun rises, and the world indifferent continues. Before the iron, before the dust, before the long march into erasure, there was ordinary life. Not grand, not romanticized. Simple. Women rising before sunrise to grind grain, to fetch water, to tend children still heavy with sleep. Laughter in courtyards. Arguments over nothing. Songs passed down by mothers who learned them from mothers who were never recorded by history. These were not abstract figures waiting to be captured. They were people embedded in rhythms older than any empire. They had names. Lineage, places in the social fabric. Some were newly married, some were pregnant. Some were still children, not yet taught the full weight of the world. Their futures were already forming, marriages planned, fields inherited, lives unfolding within the narrow but meaningful boundaries of their communities. The violence that came did not replace these futures, it annihilated them. The raids did not just steal bodies, they collapsed entire worlds in a single night. Elders left dead in doorways. Children scattered into bush and darkness. Homes burned so thoroughly that even memory struggled to return. For the women who were taken, the last image of their former lives was often smoke rising over everything they had ever known. And this is the part history rarely lingers on. The moment before, the final ordinary day. Because it is easier to describe suffering when the victims are already stripped of context. Easier to count them once they are reduced to cargo. Harder to admit that what was destroyed was not just freedom, but continuity. Culture, belonging. The quiet certainty of knowing who you were in the world. When the chains closed, they did not fall on emptiness. They fell on full lives. And that is what made the loss absolute. They did not arrive as armies, they arrived as shadows. Small, fast-moving groups guided by informants, collaborators, and men who knew the terrain better than the people who lived on it. Sometimes at night, sometimes at dawn, always when resistance would be weakest. Villages were not conquered, they were harvested. The first sound was often screaming, not from battle, but from surprise. Doors forced open, huts set alight to drive people into the open. Men killed quickly, old people struck down where they stood. Children grabbed and dropped in the chaos, and women, always the women, pulled from hiding places where they had already learned to crouch and hold their breath. Hair became a handle, clothing became leverage. A human body became an object to be moved. There was no negotiation, no explanation, no chance to understand. One moment you were in your home. The next you were being dragged across the ground while someone else screamed your name behind you. That sound followed many women for the rest of their lives. The voice of a mother, a sister, a child, fading as distance grew. Some tried to fight. They were beaten. Some tried to run. They were hunted. Some froze. They were bound. The process was efficient because it had been repeated for centuries. This was not chaos. It was method, routes planned, buyers anticipated, profits already calculated before the first chain was fastened. By the time the raiders left, the village was not just damaged. It was emptied. What remained were ashes, blood, and the silence of absence. The women were already gone, pushed forward into a system that had no use for their past and no intention of giving them a future. This was the true beginning. Not the market. Not the caravan. The moment when the world split in two and there was no way back. Once the captives were gathered, the chaos of the raid gave way to calculation. The shouting faded, the fires burned down, and the women were made to stand, lined up, turned, examined. This was the moment when fear shifted into something colder, because it became clear that survival itself would be decided by other people's preferences. Age was judged with a glance. Bodies were assessed without shame, teeth checked, limbs tested. Those too young, too old, too sick, too injured were separated without ceremony. Some were abandoned. Some were killed. Some were simply left behind because they would slow the march. Efficiency was valued over mercy. Always. The younger women were grouped together, the stronger ones, the ones whose bodies suggested endurance, fertility, compliance. Not because anyone cared about their well-being, but because their suffering would be more profitable. In this system, health was not protection. It was a liability. It meant a longer life of use. There was no privacy, no dignity, no pretense of restraint. Men discussed them as one might discuss livestock. This one is strong. That one will fetch a higher price. This one is suitable for a household. That one for the journey. The language was practical. The tone was detached. The violence was quiet but absolute, and the women understood. Even without sharing a language, they understood. They saw who was being taken, who was being pushed aside, who was being struck when they resisted. In that moment, many realized that their bodies no longer belonged to them, that their fate was no longer random. It was being decided. The selection was not a pause between violences. It was a violence of its own, because it was the point at which human beings were officially converted into categories. And once categorized, everything that followed became easier to justify. The journey began immediately, no time to grieve, no time to understand. Chains were fastened, ropes were tied, and the line started moving. Across open land, into forest, toward desert. The direction did not matter, only that it led away from everything they had ever known. They walked from sunrise to nightfall, sometimes longer, bare feet on stone, ankles raw from iron, shoulders burning under the weight of fear and exhaustion. Water was rationed. Food was calculated, not to sustain, only to preserve. A body that collapses is a body that loses value. Those who stumbled were pulled up. Those who fell were beaten. Those who could not rise were left behind. Sometimes alive, sometimes not. The caravan did not stop for death. It absorbed it, stepped over it, moved on. The desert was the worst. Heat that stripped strength from bone. Wind that filled mouths and eyes with sand. Nights so cold they shook. Women fainted. Women cried. Women went silent. Silence was the most dangerous sign of all. Some tried to speak, to ask, to plead. They were ignored. Language was irrelevant now. The only communication that mattered was the pull of the rope and the strike of the stick. Children died on the road. So did mothers. Sometimes a woman was forced to keep walking while carrying the body of her own child until someone cut it away. Efficiency over grief. Movement over humanity. This was not a transfer. It was a filtration. A process designed to break the weak and harden the rest. By the time the caravan reached its destination, the women who remained were already altered. Thinner, quieter, slower to react. Already learning the rules of a world where pain had no witness, and mercy had no meaning. The march was not just a road, it was the first stage of erasure. For many women, the abuse did not wait for the market. It did not wait for a buyer, it did not wait for permission. It began on the road, in the bush, behind tents, in the dark spaces between stops, where no one would intervene and no record would ever exist. The caravan was not only a transport system, it was a moving zone of lawlessness. There were no witnesses who mattered, no authorities to appeal to, no protection except endurance. The men who guarded them were also the men who controlled their bodies. Power was immediate and absolute. Refusal meant beating. Resistance meant worse. Silence became survival. This was not hidden behavior. It was normalized, expected, built into the system. The women learned quickly that their suffering was not an exception. It was part of the process, a preview of what awaited them, a lesson in ownership delivered through pain. Some tried to fight. They were restrained. Some tried to escape. They were hunted. Some simply closed their eyes and waited for it to end. The psychological damage began here, long before any household or harem, before any name was assigned, before any price was set. And the most brutal truth is this: the system did not see this as cruelty. It saw it as entitlement, as spoil, as privilege earned through capture. The bodies of African women were treated as extensions of victory, not as human beings capable of suffering. By the time the women reached the markets, many had already been broken in ways that would never heal. What came later did not begin the trauma, it continued it. And that continuity is what made the experience worse than death. Because death ends, this did not. For the women, control did not end with capture. It deepened, it became systematic. Their bodies were not only owned, they were managed, regulated, altered to fit the demands of households, harems, and rulers who saw reproduction, loyalty, and obedience as logistical problems to be solved. In many regions, eunuchs were used as guards and overseers, men mutilated so that no threat could exist inside the private spaces of power. Their presence was not accidental. It was a signal, a reminder that sexual control was an obsession, that the system feared both desire and rebellion. Women were locked away, monitored, isolated from each other, isolated from the world, their movements restricted not for protection, but for containment. Some women were deliberately prevented from forming families. Others were forced into reproductive roles without choice. Fertility became currency. Infertility became punishment. The body was no longer a private space, it was a site of policy. This was not random cruelty, it was administration, an architecture of control built around the female body. Where a woman slept, who she saw, when she was touched, whether she bore children, all of it was decided by someone else. And once that pattern was established, it became self-perpetuating. The household enforced it, the market supported it, the law protected it. The women learned that even their most intimate boundaries no longer existed. That privacy had been confiscated, along with freedom. That their bodies were no longer theirs in any sense that mattered. This was not simply slavery. It was total domination. And it was designed to leave nothing untouched. By the time they reached the trading centers, the women were no longer travelers. They were inventory. Lined up beneath open skies or inside walled courtyards, they stood in silence while men approached to inspect what had already been taken from them. There was no ceremony, no illusion of dignity, only evaluation. Hands lifted chins, fingers pressed into arms, eyes traced bodies with the same indifference used to examine animals. Teeth were checked, skin was prodded. Hips were judged for fertility. Scars were noted as defects, weakness as liability, youth as profit. The women were discussed in front of them as if they were not present, as if they could not hear, as if language were the only barrier to understanding humiliation. Prices were negotiated over their heads, bargains struck, futures decided. A gesture from a buyer, a nod from a seller, and a life-changed direction. Some were sold to households, some to merchants, some to courts. Some disappeared into networks that never recorded names. The markets were loud, chaotic, public, and yet deeply private in their cruelty, because what was being traded was not labor alone. It was access, control, ownership of another human being's body and time. The women learned quickly that they were no longer addressed as people, only as origins, functions, values. This was the point at which the transformation was completed, from captive to commodity, from person to property. And once the transaction ended, there was no appeal, no return, no undoing. The sale was final, and so was the silence that followed. The doors closed quietly, no chains, no noise, no spectacle, just walls, curtains, and the slow realization that escape was no longer even a concept. For many women, the market was not the end of movement. It was the end of visibility. They were absorbed into private spaces where suffering became invisible, and therefore easier to sustain. Inside households, their lives narrowed. Rooms became borders, corridors became limits. They were taught when to stand, when to kneel, when to speak, when to disappear. Every gesture was monitored, every mistake remembered. Obedience was not encouraged, it was demanded. In harems, isolation was complete. Women were separated from their own languages, from their own cultures, from any sense of collective identity that might become strength. Surveillance was constant, rivalry was encouraged, solidarity was dangerous. The system understood that loneliness breaks people faster than violence. They were dressed, undressed, moved, and positioned according to schedules they did not control. Their days were filled with waiting to be summoned, waiting to be dismissed, waiting to be ignored, waiting to be needed. The uncertainty was its own punishment. Never knowing what would be required of you, never knowing when. Some were treated as status symbols, others as domestic tools, others as silent presences meant to decorate power. The role did not matter. The result was the same, a life stripped of agency, reduced to function. From the outside, these spaces were described as luxurious. From the inside, they were prisons with soft walls. And the women learned quickly that comfort does not equal freedom. Sometimes it only makes captivity harder to explain. This was not rescue. It was relocation. And it came with rules that could not be questioned and consequences that could not be escaped. In the households where they were confined, some women were chosen for a crueler purpose than servitude alone. They became instruments of reproduction, their bodies mapped, measured and assigned according to the desires and plans of men who saw lineage as currency. Fertility was not celebrated. It was exploited. Children were born not from love, but from calculation, and often taken from their mothers immediately, raised as property of another household, another owner, another empire. Those who could not conceive were discarded quietly, sometimes sent back to the markets, sometimes sent to labor camps, sometimes simply vanished, no record, no mourning, no recognition. In a system designed to treat women as assets, value was always temporary, contingent, and calculated. The moment usefulness ended, a woman's life became a liability. Resistance was dangerous. A woman who refused, who hid, who delayed, was punished. Beatings, isolation, threats of death. The psychological weight of knowing that even a child born could not guarantee protection, that even compliance could not guarantee safety, pressed on every day. The cycle repeated endlessly. Arrival, ownership, forced reproduction, disposal. Life became a series of transactions disguised as routine. For the women, the horror was not in a single act, but in the continuity. The slow, grinding erosion of self. The knowledge that survival was no longer a triumph. It was a compromise, a temporary reprieve, a waiting room for the next decision someone else would make about your body, your children, your future. This was worse than death. Death ends suffering. This did not. It only reshaped it, layered it, passed it forward, generation after generation, until the world itself seemed indifferent to the pain it had created. The violence and exploitation were never seen as exceptions. They were woven into the frameworks of belief, law, and custom. Religion was used not to protect the vulnerable, but to justify the possession of them. Texts and teachings were interpreted or rewritten to declare ownership divinely sanctioned, as if faith could sanctify chains, humiliation, and coercion. In households, in courts, and on the roads, the traders and rulers invoked morality to cover brutality. A woman's suffering was explained as her fate, her duty, her place in a cosmic order she could neither understand nor escape. Preachers and scholars offered guidance not to alleviate harm, but to ensure obedience. The act of domination was dressed in righteousness. The chains were holy. The markets, temples, and harems alike became stages for this sanctioned cruelty. Even compliance was framed as virtue, silence became piety, endurance became devotion. And for the women, every act of resistance, every flicker of personal will, was cast as sin, as rebellion, as justification for further punishment. Their bodies were made to bear not only labor and desire, but also guilt. Through this perverse lens, the system transformed itself into something immutable. Violence was no longer just profitable, it became righteous. The women's suffering was no longer accidental. It was framed as necessary, sacred. And in this way, the Arab slave trade ensured that cruelty was never questioned, only obeyed. By the time a woman understood the power of religion in her captivity, the chains were already inside her mind. The erasure of freedom had become complete, not only of body, but of belief, identity, and hope. Even in the most controlled spaces, resistance emerged. It was quiet at first, a whispered refusal, a hidden act of defiance, a stolen morsel of autonomy. Some women tried to escape, some refused to perform the tasks assigned, some resisted the sexual demands imposed on them. Each act, small or large, was met with swift and calculated retaliation. Punishments were public, brutal, and meticulously recorded by those who sought to maintain order through terror. Beatings left permanent scars, both visible and unseen. Isolation could stretch for months. Threats of death hung over the women constantly. A single misstep might lead to execution, or to a form of suffering designed to be remembered by others, a warning carved into the psyche of every captive. Rebellion, when it came in larger forms, was crushed decisively. Groups of women attempting escape were hunted down, chained, and sometimes killed in front of others. The system was designed to teach one lesson. Disobedience would not only fail, it would amplify suffering. Survival required submission. Humanity became a bargaining chip. Even when resistance succeeded temporarily, it carried a cost. Women recaptured after escape were often punished more severely, their bodies and spirits branded with humiliation. And yet, despite the cruelty, resistance persisted. Every whisper of defiance was a testament to human will, to memory, to identity, refusing to be erased completely. This constant push and pull between control and defiance was the invisible engine of the trade, a psychological landscape as lethal as any blade, where fear, hope, and endurance collided in silence. For the women, survival was never victory. It was negotiation with a world determined to erase them. For many, the journey did not end at the market. Ships waited at ports along the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, or the East African coast, ready to transport their human cargo to distant lands. The women were chained below deck, packed like merchandise, with barely enough room to sit upright. Air was thick, stifling. Darkness pressed against their eyes. The rocking of the ship became a constant reminder that the world they knew was gone forever. Rations were calculated to keep them alive, but only barely. Disease spread quickly in the close quarters. Fever, dysentery, dehydration. These were as deadly as any lash. Many women did not survive the voyage, their bodies simply thrown overboard, unrecorded, unmarked, and forgotten. The survivors arrived broken in body and spirit, carrying the memories of months of terror within them. On board, the women learned that the sea could be as cruel as the desert. Hunger, thirst, sickness, and fear became intertwined, forming a relentless cycle of suffering. Yet even amid the torment, some clung to the smallest threads of hope, holding hands, whispering prayers, remembering names that had not yet been erased. This passage was more than a journey. It was a crucible designed to strip women of identity, to prepare them for the absolute domination awaiting them on foreign soil. Every wave, every gust of wind, every splash against the hull reminded them that the world had narrowed, that freedom was no longer possible, and that survival itself had become a fragile, daily achievement. By the time the ships docked, the women who stepped onto foreign sands were no longer simply captives. They were objects of commerce, instruments of policy, and carriers of trauma that would ripple through generations. The sea had taken its toll, and what remained was a human body tethered to a fate not of its own choosing. When the ships finally docked at distant ports, the ordeal did not end. It transformed. The women were unloaded, still chained, still fragile from disease, exhaustion, and hunger. They were herded into warehouses, often the same spaces used to store grain, spices, or livestock. Their humanity was invisible here. They were counted, catalogued, and prepared for distribution. Buyers inspected them with the same cold efficiency as merchants examining any other commodity. Strength, fertility, obedience, youth. Each attribute carried a price. Those who had survived the voyage were considered valuable precisely because of the suffering they had endured. The weakest, the sick, the non-compliant, were sold in bulk or discarded entirely. Death continued to shadow them, even as new owners claimed them. Assignments were not random. Households, harems, and rulers each received women selected to fulfill specific purposes: servitude, reproduction, companionship, or labor. Names were rarely used. Origins were recorded instead: the region, the tribe, the type. A woman became a category, a statistic, a possession. Her life was no longer her own, and the rules of her captivity were enforced by those who understood that obedience was the only way to survive. Even the briefest interactions with fellow captives were regulated. Solidarity was dangerous, defiance deadly. Women learned quickly that safety was temporary, and survival demanded compliance, silence, and endurance. Every step of this process, from arrival to distribution, reinforced the lessons first taught on the road: that their bodies, their labor, and their futures belonged entirely to others. By the end of the distribution, the women were scattered across cities, kingdoms, and households, far from the homes they had lost. And yet, the memory of the journey, of capture, and of the seas that had carried them remained, an indelible mark of a life that had been stolen before it could fully begin.